On a cool autumn morning in 1945, Dwight D. Eisenhower stood alone in his temporary office in Frankfurt, staring at a Europe that no longer needed generals the way it once had. The war was over. The maps that had once dictated every breath of his existence were being rolled up and filed away. But one problem refused to disappear with the sound of the last gunshot. That problem was George S. Patton. For years, Eisenhower had depended on Patton in moments when hesitation would have been fatal. North Africa, Sicily, France, Germany. When speed mattered, when audacity was required, when an enemy line had to be shattered rather than negotiated with, Eisenhower turned to Patton without question. He knew Patton's flaws. He knew his temper. He knew his tendency to speak before thinking. But in war, those traits were manageable. Sometimes they were even assets. Peace was different, and Eisenhower understood that before almost anyone else. Before we go further, tell me in the comments where in the world you're watching from. And if you enjoy content like this, make sure to subscribe so you don't miss the next video. In public, the relationship between Eisenhower and Patton appeared unchanged, professional, respectful, unified. But behind closed doors, something fundamental had shifted. Eisenhower no longer needed a battlefield commander who thrived on momentum and confrontation. He needed discipline, restraint, and a willingness to subordinate personal instinct to political necessity. Patton struggled with all three. The first bonds appeared quietly. A comment here, a frustrated remark there. Eisenhower initially brushed them aside, believing Patton would adjust once the realities of occupation set in. Patton had always adapted in the past. Why not now? But as weeks passed, Eisenhower realized Patton was not adapting. He was resisting. Patton viewed the occupation of Germany as an extension of the war rather than a fundamentally new mission. He saw denazification policies as impractical. He resented civilian administrators. He bristled at directives that emphasized reconciliation over punishment or patience over speed. To Patton, Germany needed order, not hesitation. Eisenhower saw something else. He saw a continent on the edge of collapse, where a single misstep could fracture the Allied coalition. He saw Soviet observers watching every American move with calculated interest. He saw British officials growing uneasy. He saw French leaders anxious about how Germany would be treated. And he saw Patton, brilliant, fearless, and increasingly unpredictable, standing at the center of it all. In late August 1945, Eisenhower received transcripts of Patton's comments to the press. He read them carefully, line by line. The comparison of former Nazi Party members to political groups in the United States troubled him deeply. Not because he believed Patton sympathized with Nazism, Eisenhower knew better, but because the statement ignored the political consequences it would unleash. Eisenhower closed the folder and sat back in his chair. For the first time since the war had ended, he felt something close to dread. Patton's words were already spreading beyond Germany. British diplomats were asking questions. Soviet media seized on the remarks with barely concealed enthusiasm. Civilian administrators in Germany were struggling to maintain credibility. Eisenhower understood instantly what Patton did not. Perception now mattered more than force. That night, Eisenhower wrote a private note to himself. It was not intended for publication. It was not even a formal memo. It was a reminder. "George is a war commander," he wrote. "This is no longer a war." The realization weighed heavily on him. Eisenhower did not enjoy disciplining Patton. He never had. Throughout the war, he had shielded Patton repeatedly, from political fallout, from media backlash, from his own worst impulses. Eisenhower had believed that Patton's value on the battlefield justified the effort, but the battlefield was gone. In its place stood the far more fragile terrain of post-war Europe. Eisenhower met with his senior staff repeatedly over the following days. Lucius Clay, Omar Bradley, British liaison officers, civilian administrators. The message was consistent. Patton was becoming a liability, not through disloyalty, not through incompetence, but through rigidity. Patton believed that clarity required bluntness. Eisenhower believed clarity now required discipline. The difference between those views would decide Patton's fate. In early September, Eisenhower requested a private meeting with Patton. No aides, no press, just the two men who had won the war together. Patton arrived confident, expecting another difficult but manageable conversation. Eisenhower listened as Patton defended his comments, explained his views on Germany, and warned again about Soviet intentions. Patton was passionate, articulate, and utterly convinced he was right. Eisenhower did not interrupt. When Patton finished, Eisenhower spoke quietly. "George," he said, "the war rewarded your instincts. The peace will punish them." Patton bristled. Eisenhower continued, calm but firm. "Every word you say now is policy, whether you intend it or not, and I cannot allow that." Patton pushed back. He argued that Germany would collapse under weak administration. He argued that the Soviets were the real enemy. He argued that speed and firmness were the only solutions. Eisenhower did not argue back. He already knew something Patton did not. The decision had been made. In his own mind, Eisenhower had crossed a line from accommodation to action. He could no longer protect Patton without undermining the mission he had been tasked to complete. After Patton left the room, Eisenhower remained seated for a long time. He thought about the campaigns they had fought together, the risks they had taken, the trust they had shared, and then he thought about the responsibility he now carried. He was no longer just a general. He was the supreme commander of the occupation, and that meant choosing stability over loyalty. In a confidential message to Washington, Eisenhower summarized the situation carefully. He praised Patton's service. He emphasized his wartime achievements. But he concluded with a sentence that carried enormous weight. General Patton's continued presence in his current role is incompatible with the requirements of the occupation. The words were precise, clinical, final. Eisenhower did not take pleasure in writing them. But once written, he did not reconsider. From that moment on, the relationship between Eisenhower and Patton changed irrevocably. Eisenhower no longer viewed Patton as an asset to be managed. He viewed him as a risk to be contained. It was not betrayal. It was not resentment. It was a recognition that the man who thrived in war could destabilize the peace. And Eisenhower, who had spent his entire career preventing catastrophic failure, was not willing to gamble the future of Europe on a single personality, no matter how legendary. That was the moment Eisenhower turned on Patton, not in anger, not in public, but with quiet finality. And once he did, he never looked back. In the days that followed Eisenhower's private meeting with Patton, the atmosphere inside Allied headquarters grew noticeably tense. Nothing had been announced, no orders had been issued, yet everyone sensed that something fundamental had shifted. The war had ended, but the battle for Europe's future was only beginning, and Eisenhower knew that every decision now carried consequences far beyond the military sphere. Patton, for his part, did not retreat. If anything, he doubled down on his convictions. He spoke openly to officers about the dangers of Soviet expansion. He complained about the inefficiency of civilian administrators. He dismissed denazification policies as impractical and counterproductive. To Patton, these were honest assessments. To Eisenhower, they were landmines. Reports continued to arrive on Eisenhower's desk. British liaison officers expressed concern that Patton's comments were undermining Allied unity. French officials worried that leniency toward former Nazis would destabilize already fragile governments. American civil authorities in Germany warned that Patton's rhetoric was eroding their authority among local populations. Eisenhower read every report carefully. He did not exaggerate the problem. He did not dramatize it, but he recognized a pattern forming, one that could no longer be ignored. This was not about a single remark. It was about trajectory. Eisenhower understood trajectory better than most. He had spent years watching battles turn, not on isolated moments, but on momentum. And Patton's momentum was now pulling in the wrong direction. Behind closed doors, Eisenhower spoke candidly with his senior commanders. Omar Bradley, who knew Patton as well as anyone, was particularly direct. "George doesn't see limits," Bradley said. "That's why he's brilliant in war. But limits are all that exist now." Eisenhower nodded. Bradley continued, "If he stays where he is, he will keep colliding with the occupation, and each collision will make things worse." Eisenhower had already reached the same conclusion. What troubled him most was not Patton's strategic outlook. Eisenhower privately agreed that the Soviet Union posed a long-term threat. He was not naive about Stalin's ambitions, but Eisenhower believed the response to that threat required unity, patience, and coordination, not unilateral declarations from a general whose words carried disproportionate weight. In one confidential conversation with a British official, Eisenhower remarked, We must not hand Moscow an excuse to claim we cannot govern ourselves. Patton, unintentionally, was doing exactly that. As September wore on, Eisenhower drafted multiple versions of the same order. Each version reflected the same outcome, Patton's removal from his command, but differed in tone. Eisenhower agonized over the language. He wanted to preserve Patton's dignity. He wanted to avoid public controversy. He wanted to ensure that history would understand the decision as administrative, not punitive. Yet, no matter how carefully he phrased it, the reality remained unchanged. Patton could not continue. Eisenhower sent a detailed assessment to Washington outlining the situation. He emphasized Patton's wartime achievements and loyalty. He made clear that the issue was not disobedience or incompetence. But he concluded with a firm recommendation that Patton be reassigned to a position that removed him from the political center of the occupation. The response from Washington was swift and supportive. Eisenhower did not feel relief. He felt resolve. With approval secured, Eisenhower scheduled another meeting with Patton. This one would be different. There would be no debate, no attempt at persuasion, only the execution of a decision already made. Patton arrived visibly agitated. He had sensed the shift. Eisenhower spoke calmly, explaining that Patton would be reassigned. He emphasized respect. He praised Patton's service. He avoided moral judgment. Patton listened in silence. When Eisenhower finished, Patton finally spoke. "You're making a mistake," he said. Not angrily, not bitterly, simply as a statement of belief. Eisenhower did not argue. "Perhaps," he replied, "but it's my responsibility to make it." The meeting ended without drama. No raised voices, no threats. Just two men standing on opposite sides of a moment history would later compress into a footnote. After Patton left, Eisenhower sat alone for several minutes. He thought about the campaigns they had fought together, the trust he had placed in Patton when others doubted him. He remembered defending Patton after earlier controversies, believing the war required men willing to take risks. But this was not the same world. Eisenhower understood that leadership sometimes required cutting away what had once been indispensable. When news of Patton's reassignment became public, reactions were mixed but muted. The American press largely accepted the explanation. The army closed ranks. The public, weary of war, moved on quickly. Behind the scenes, however, Eisenhower watched closely. He monitored the occupation's stability. He listened to reports from Germany. And gradually, he saw the tensions ease. Civil administrators gained authority. Allied coordination improved. Soviet propaganda lost a convenient target. Eisenhower did not celebrate these developments. He merely noted them. In private correspondence, he wrote, "Sometimes the absence of disruption is the surest sign that the right decision was made." Patton never returned to a position of comparable influence. Eisenhower did not reconsider. He did not reopen the question. The relationship that had once defined the Allied advance across Europe was over, and Eisenhower, once he had turned, did not look back. Not because he lacked loyalty, but because he understood that loyalty to a mission must always outweigh loyalty to an individual. The war had required Patton. The peace required restraint. Eisenhower chose the peace. Once the decision was carried out, Eisenhower did something few expected. He stopped talking about Patton almost entirely. There were no lingering justifications, no public explanations, no effort to shape the narrative beyond what was strictly necessary. Eisenhower believed that once a command decision was made, revisiting it only weakened authority. The matter, in his mind, was closed. Privately, however, the consequences of the choice stayed with him. In the weeks after Patton's reassignment, Eisenhower continued to receive updates from Germany. Each report confirmed what he had anticipated. The occupation grew more orderly. Civilian administrators found it easier to implement policy. Allied coordination stabilized. The British expressed quiet relief. Even the Soviets, deprived of an easy propaganda target, shifted their messaging elsewhere. None of this surprised Eisenhower. What surprised him was the silence that followed. Patton did not protest publicly. He did not rally supporters. He did not attempt to undermine the command structure. True to Eisenhower's expectation, Patton obeyed the order as a soldier, but the distance between them became permanent. The two men who had once spoken almost daily during the height of the war no longer communicated except through formal channels. Eisenhower did not reach out. He knew better. reopening the relationship would serve no purpose. The trust that had existed on the battlefield depended on a shared understanding of objectives. That understanding no longer existed. Patton still saw the world through the lens of imminent conflict. Eisenhower saw a world that might still be salvaged through restraint. In December 1945, news reached Eisenhower of Patton's car accident. The report was brief at first. Serious injuries, uncertain prognosis. Eisenhower read it twice. He said nothing. Those nearby later recalled that he sat very still for a long time. When Patton died days later, Eisenhower reacted with visible grief. He ordered full honors without hesitation. He approved every ceremonial detail. He ensured that Patton's service record would remain unblemished. Eisenhower understood that whatever disagreements had existed between them after the war, they did not erase the debt owed to Patton's wartime leadership. But even in grief, Eisenhower did not second-guess his decision. He understood something many later commentators would miss. Patton's death did not change the reality of the post-war moment. It did not retroactively make Patton suitable for a role he could no longer fulfill. It did not alter the risks Eisenhower had been responsible for managing. In private correspondence after the funeral, Eisenhower wrote a single line that captured his perspective with stark clarity. He was indispensable in war. The peace demanded something else. That sentence would never appear in a speech. It was not meant for public consumption. It was a personal acknowledgement of the tragedy inherent in transitions, when greatness forged for one purpose becomes incompatible with another. As the months passed, Eisenhower's focus shifted fully to the broader challenges of rebuilding Europe. The Marshall Plan began to take shape. The early contours of the Cold War hardened. Berlin became a focal point of tension. The occupation transformed from military oversight into political engineering. At every step, Eisenhower's instincts proved cautious, deliberate, and collaborative. He avoided unnecessary provocation. He prioritized unity. He sought stability over spectacle. And in doing so, he confirmed what his decision regarding Patton had already revealed. Eisenhower was not interested in heroes. He was interested in outcomes. Years later, as Eisenhower prepared to enter politics himself, journalists occasionally asked about Patton. They expected anecdotes, perhaps regret, perhaps some admission of personal conflict. Eisenhower offered none of it. He spoke respectfully, briefly, and without elaboration. General Patton was a great commander, he would say. He served his country with distinction. And then he would stop. Those who knew Eisenhower well understood what lay beneath that restraint. He believed that revisiting the decision would only invite misunderstanding. The public wanted simple stories, heroes and villains, loyalty and betrayal. Eisenhower knew reality was more complicated. Patton had not failed. The world had changed. Eisenhower, more than almost anyone else, understood how rare that clarity was. He had spent his career managing powerful personalities, aligning competing interests, and preventing catastrophe through discipline rather than drama. Turning away from Patton was not a personal act. It was an extension of that philosophy. In later years, historians would debate whether Eisenhower should have handled Patton differently. Some argued Patton's warnings about the Soviet Union were prophetic. Others suggested Eisenhower sacrificed a brilliant strategist to preserve political harmony. Eisenhower never engaged in those debates. He believed leadership meant absorbing criticism without reopening settled decisions. And he believed that Patton's legacy belonged to the war, not the peace that followed it. In one private reflection recorded near the end of his life, Eisenhower addressed the matter indirectly. "History tends to confuse courage with wisdom," he wrote. "They are not the same thing, though both are necessary at different times." That line explained everything. Patton embodied courage, raw, unyielding, unfiltered. Eisenhower embodied restraint, measured, patient, disciplined. Both qualities had been essential to victory, but only one could sustain peace. The moment Eisenhower turned on Patton, if it could even be called that, was not a betrayal. It was a recognition that the tools required to win a war are not the tools required to secure its aftermath. Once Eisenhower made that recognition, he did not look back. Because looking back would have meant questioning a choice that, in his mind, had preserved Allied unity at the most dangerous moment of transition. And Eisenhower was not a man who lived in the past. He lived in responsibility. Patton's legend grew in the decades that followed. Books, films, and speeches immortalized his battlefield brilliance. Eisenhower did not object. He understood that nations need legends, but he also understood something else. Legends are made for war. Peace is made by men willing to disappoint them. That was the role Eisenhower accepted. And that is why, after the war, he turned away from Patton and never looked back. What do you think? Share your thoughts in the comments. And if you want more true stories from the hidden corners of history, don't forget to like this video and subscribe to the channel.